to the Centre for Book Cultures and Publishing and to the University of Reading for hosting this second event. My name is Ruth Blaxell and I'm here based at the University of Reading in the Department of Typography and Graphic Communication. So by way of introduction and just to recap for those of you who weren't able to join us back in 2021, our first panel event was in April 21 and we focused on experimental publishing and alternative networked cultures. And this event, Experimental Publishing and New Archive Initiatives, is intended to be seen as still broadly connected, but with a slightly different point of focus to the first event. So the first event for me was connected to my interest in the ways in which published documents have been used historically for experiments in writing, performance, and art and design practice to produce published works that shift away from fixed to more subjective and fluid forms that are contingent upon dynamic and interactive contexts, with the formats and operations of published documents or records being specifically used to create open-ended, iterative or contingent outcomes that, amongst other things, can subvert or sidestep the confines of traditional or institutional contexts. With the event tonight, I'm interested in the ways in which new initiatives with and reformations of the archive have provided an opportunity for better articulations of published works of this type, works which might have been and still might be misunderstood or dismissed as unconventional within traditional fixed form publishing and archival categorizations that are still common in institutional libraries and collections of books, documents, and published ephemera. Also, since unconventional publishing forms have often been adopted and developed by marginalized or overlooked communities who've seen themselves as excluded from mainstream production, distribution, and preservation contexts, the archive can be seen and has been seen or used to reveal and demonstrate the critical importance and relevance of these types of engagement to current discourse around diversity and inclusivity, and to highlight the connections between particular published formats and particular communities and their networks. So in conceiving these two research events in relation to the teaching in my department, I've also been continuing to develop opportunities within the MA Communication Design programme to introduce design students to the ways in which digital advancements in publication design have drawn on a lineage of experimental grassroots practice, which can also be connected at points to the emergence and developmental lineage of digital desktop publishing and archiving tools and to social media. Through the teaching context, I've therefore been able to highlight the historical underpinnings within contemporary works that rely upon and exploit hybrid relations between fixed, printed and dynamic digital forms. And recently to look at how this might be leading to an opening up of new conceptions of the archive itself as a type of publication design, or at least to point to convergences between new initiatives in publication design and the archive. So this year I've had the opportunity to work with the design practitioner Francesca Romano and the postgraduate researcher Berta Ferrer in developing an unfolding narratives project that builds upon original content previously developed by Lizana Rosanova through her several years of teaching on the MA programme, alongside conducting her own doctoral research with Rhizome and London South Bank University. So I'm going to hand over to Lizana now to talk briefly about her teaching and her research and her own interest in co-convening this event, and then to introduce the speakers in the context of our shared interests. And I look forward to coming back for some more discussion in the Q&A at the end. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Ruth, for setting up the context. Well, can you all hear me? Actually, for some reason, I think I was muted and I thought I was speaking.
Yes, I can hear you.
So sorry if I'm going to repeat this twice, but I just want to say thanks so much, Ruth, for setting up the context for us. And I'm also very happy to be here tonight and to have the chance to co-organize this event. As Ruth mentioned, I have been doing a PhD research. Okay, I'm spotlighted. Sorry, just Zoom keeps sending me these interruption messages, but everything should be fine. So as Ruth mentioned, I have been doing a PhD research project concerning related topics. And I also used to teach in Reading on the MA Communication Design course. From 2017 to 2021, I taught a module on experimental and hybrid publishing forms called Publishing Platforms, which was concerned with the complex relations between designers, users, and the infrastructure of online databases, public archives, and commercial platforms. During that time, I was also working on my PhD research at London South Bank University, which focused on the design of digital archive systems. I was working primarily with the NetArt collection at Rhizome, which brought out the difficulties of capturing networked culture within what is traditionally considered to be a fixed form, the archive database. So working with this archive meant working on a niche avant-garde topic, but a topic that was gaining traction among more mainstream, large collecting institutions. What might have seemed initially as experimental work, both in the sense of the art genre, net art, and the nature of the archival system, which was a linked open data database built with a wiki open source software. So that work was actually able to speak to problems at the core of what we might think as the establishment or the canon of archival and library science. Large institutions now recognize that they cannot adequately describe the extraordinary variety of publications, artworks, and other forms of cultural production within the narrow scope of vocabularies and data schemas originating from colonial administration practices. For example, I now work at one of the largest research institutions in Germany on a national project to develop infrastructure for cultural data, and we are using the same software I was using during my PhD research. Even during my PhD, I was involved in conversations and consultations that spanned different cultural contexts, from smaller countercultural archives to large national institutions, including the National Archives, the British Library, and the V&A, to name just a few examples from the UK. All that is to say that work that may at first seem as experimental, marginal, avant-garde, is in fact the work that is increasingly moving the conversation forward across the cultural heritage and research fields. Over the past 4 to 5 years, through my research and teaching activities, I was lucky enough to meet and collaborate with many other creative practitioners, including our guest panelists today, who are also pursuing what may be labeled as experimental practice across art, design, and publishing, yet they're able to speak to very timely and highly significant cultural issues with broad resonance. To that end, and without further ado, I want to introduce our guest speakers today, as well as the running order. In the interest of time, I will not read out their full bios, and I think hopefully you will be able to see a link in the chat pretty soon that will have that will give you access to the full bios if you want to read them. So first up, we'll hear from Simon Brown. Simon is an artist, researcher, and the initiator of the Bootleg Library, a digital, physical, social collection of texts and readers, and it's the project that we'll hear more about in this presentation. I met Simon a few years ago through his connection to the experimental publishing master's program at the Piet Zwart Institute in Rotterdam, and through his work with the collective Varia, an experimental space and group of creatives in Rotterdam. I invited him to do a talk to the MA students in Reading last year, since due to his background in graphic design, his practice was a particularly good example of thinking through problems that go beyond the discipline of design and intersect with critical technology, networks, making information public, and collaborating with others. His work with materials that were or are bootlegged, copied, sampled, or appropriated, remixed, and republished in the context of the Bootleg Library further ties well to the rich history of experimental publishing and pirate practices we also touched upon in the previous event in this series. Next, we'll hear from Amy Clark, an artist, educator, and founder of Banner Repeater, a reading room with the Public Archive of Artists Publishing and project space on a working train station platform in Hackney Downs, London. Amy has lectured widely on the art historical significance of artist publishing and the potential of the publications to experiment with form and meaning making. questioning how the rich socio-technical context of experimental publishing can be archived was in part the impetus for conceptualizing the digital archive of artists publishing, a free and open platform that would connect publications with rich contextual information that was added by the archive's users and contributors. I originally met Amy through the events program at Banner Repeater and later joined the DAP project as consultant on the technical infrastructure. In today's talk, Amy will elaborate on the artistic, social, and ethical aspects of the platform that are in constant conversation with the digital infrastructure and the broader space of the open web. And finally, designer, researcher, and educator Mindy Su will discuss her practice and, more specifically, the project Cyberfeminism Index, an in-progress online collection of resources for technocritical works from 1990 to 2020. Rhizome have described Mindy's work as a practice that, quote, reimagines the history of the internet and how this might guide its future. She developed the Cyberfeminism Index with support from Rhizome and presented it as part of the First Look exhibition series. The project is a fascinating example of what a crowdsourced, ethically conceived, and carefully open archive of digital and hybrid publications might look like, while simultaneously serving the sources of much of the feminist and queer theories and practices that directly shaped the field of critical design software and media studies as we know them today. Last year, I had the pleasure of being on a panel together with Mindy, which was titled Archival Futures in an Age of Transformative Change. It was organized by the Archivist Roundtable of Metropolitan New York, an organization representing over 160 archival repositories. Besides us, the other panelists were also showcasing experimental archival projects. What became clear then, and what I hope will become clear today, is indeed how vital practices which address experimental cultural production or center the work of marginalized communities are especially important to how both small and large organizations can evolve in step with and in response to the needs of a changing cultural landscape. After everyone's presentation, we'll hold the panel discussion and an open Q&A session moderated by Ruth and myself. So please feel free to add your questions into the chat during each talk, but bear in mind that we'll only answer them in the end. And also we may not be able to answer everyone's questions, but we'll do our best to answer as many questions as we can in the time that we have. So I will stop sharing now and I will hand over to Simon. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Lizana. Just give me a second. Okay. Yeah, thanks again. Thanks to Ruth and Lizana for inviting me. It's really lovely to be here today with Ami and Mindy. My name is Simon Brown. I'm an Australian artist, researcher, and self-proclaimed contingent librarian. I live in Rotterdam, where I'm also active as a member of Vardia, a collective interested in everyday technology. I came here in 2018 to pursue studies in the Experimental Publishing Master's Program, or XPub, at the Piet Zwart Institute, and I graduated in 2020 with the Bootleg Library. Contingent librarian is a convenient shorthand for the many actions in my practice, such as writing, programming, designing, publishing, editing, reading and structuring, and many more. These often happen in ways which are outside of or peripheral to established frameworks, legal, technological, political, social. I see the library as being much more than a place to keep files and books, and expand it to a set of actions which I compile and perform with others. Through collectively performing these actions, we can understand the politics of knowledge distribution directly. I often use free software, free as in freedom, for the conditions it both comes from and creates: collaboration, diversion, particularity, conviviality, and self-sufficiency. In my presentation today, I'm going to talk about the Bootleg Library, which began with questions about the sociality of sharing texts and the role of the librarian. In early 2019, I participated in a thematic project called Interfacing the Law, in which we explored the problem of open access in academic publishing and the phenomenon of so-called shadow libraries. This project, led by guest editor Femke Snelting, introduced me to a wide variety of librarians, both amateur and professional. we had the opportunity to join workshops, presentations, and interviews with people such as Marcel Mars and Dubravka Sekulic of Public Library / Memory of the World, and Dusan Barok of Monoscope, and many more. I'd learned that libraries give access to knowledge and produce sociality. I'd encountered many librarians of so-called shadow libraries, which were richly diverse in collection and readership. I wondered how a particular situated library could survive and the conditions that would sustain it. How could readers be represented in the library? How could the acts of reading, writing, and editing together play a part in this? How would trust and responsibility be negotiated? And what were the tasks to be performed in the shared role of librarian? In the summer holidays of 2019, I installed an ebook manager called Calibre or Calibra on a computer in the XPub studio. I connected the computer to the network, turned on the content server, and began serving files locally. I put up posters and laid out cards to invite people in the area to use it, and began describing the Bootleg Library in writing. These cards described the library's intentions and access at small scale and local. They were also used to provide login credentials to readers. I began contextualizing specific words that I was using in relation to what I was observing. Through meetings with the library's users, we determined these terms, also looking at the history of these terms. For example, to bootleg is a word that in the 17th century described the practice of hiding a weapon, usually a knife or a pistol, in the space between the leg and one's boot. During the American Prohibition era of the early 20th century, it referred to illegally producing and distributing alcohol. Nowadays, bootlegs are often thought of as deceptive, poorly manufactured rip-offs distributed on large scale for profit. I was inspired by the culture that develops from bootlegging and the refusal of singular authorship and ownership, and resistance against the singularity of the text. For example, within interpersonal networks, the practice of bootlegging enriches not only cultures, but also the things people share. In this photo, you can see self-proclaimed deadheads or diehard fans of the Grateful Dead, who were allowed to freely record and distribute copies of the band's live performances. This created a feedback loop in which sociality drove publication, and this in turn produced more sociality. The printed collection is stored in a former champagne box, which I found in the streets of Amsterdam. Currently it's in my studio, but on occasions it travels to other places where it's used at Bootleg Library sessions. It contains about 40 to 50 small books and zines. None of them are catalogued and all can be borrowed freely. In both appearance and function, it's like what is called here in the Netherlands a mini-beeb, beeb being short for bibliothek, or the Dutch word for library. You can find these mini-beebs everywhere, not just filled with old books, but also clothes and ornaments and even plants that are free for the taking. The books in the printed collection are mostly made by myself in editions of one, using a variety of techniques and tools. Some have been donated by readers as well. The printed collection is smaller than the digital collection in volume, and each book and file has been produced with its own particular motivation. Sometimes it's just about getting the text using quick and dirty methods. Sometimes it's a book produced on request. Sometimes it's wanting to produce a new version to exploit particular affordances such as searchable text of a digital file, or wanting to just simply read and write on paper. Some of the books are first-time print publications, such as this bootleg of feminist art manifestos, previously published only as HTML and EPUB. I've printed this twice now with pictures accompanying the second edition. And this copy of The Electronic Revolution by William S. Burroughs, which is extremely difficult to find in print. This one's printed on silver paper in a font I bootlegged from an old calendar. For this book, I wanted to have freedom with typography, with fonts, letter spacing, justification, paragraph, line, and page breaks. But when that happens, you find that the text becomes less referenceable for citation purposes. So for flexibility, I noted where page numbers had shifted from the source publication and kept the referenceability of the text. Some books are made very slowly. This one took 3 weeks to make. All the numbers appeared as missing characters in the only digital file that I could find. So I went to the Royal Library in The Hague and I borrowed a copy of the book so I could scan it. But I ended up having to type every number in the 433-page book by hand, including the index at the back, because the scanner kept crashing. This book was made quite quickly, scanning and printing a copy that I also borrowed from the Royal Library. I used a photocopier scanner to make a PDF from the book, and then I sent it to print over the network. The cover is also a direct scan of the book that I borrowed. The most efficient way to digitize a thick book is to use what they call a book scanner. This one, which is at XPub, was built by previous students from an open source project called the Archivist book scanner. It's an open hardware project, so you can also make one of these things yourself. Simply, you put the book on an adjustable cradle and you push a bar, then it's raised to 2 perpendicular sheets of glass, which lay the pages flat and in focus for cameras mounted to the left and the right. Pushing a USB connected pedal triggers the cameras to take photographs of each page. And this is really the most fun part. It's quite a workout otherwise. These photographs are then processed into a PDF, including a searchable OCR text layer. OCR, or optical character recognition, is the technology that converts letters in images into machine encoded text, making it searchable. I used an open source tool called Tesseract to do the OCR. The book scanner worked most of the time, but as usual, things can and will go wrong. Machines sometimes stop working, or code breaks, or methods fail. With others, I've learned to develop strategies to deal with these setbacks, such as binding books by hand when the machine was out of order, finding, begging, borrowing scripts and snippets of code to get programs to run. I began to think of these methods as contingencies or possible responses to yet unknown future scenarios. The digital bootleg library runs on the open source ebook management software Calibre Web, which is a web application fork of the original Calibre project. It contains about 605 books with 510 authors listed in 598 categories. Each document has been uploaded individually by guests and registered users. Guests can upload or download and edit metadata. And this is where I see the guests becoming writers within the library. Well, one way that they become writers. Calibre Web supports multiple file formats on the one listing, such as EPUB, PDF, and also some multimedia file formats like MP3 and MP4. Only registered users can edit private and public shelves, which are ways to organize the collection individually or together. Shelves are flexible. A book can be on multiple shelves at the same time. And this is a useful way to organize the collection, but it's not immediately apparent to a new user who often relies on categories. Categories happen through tagging, which is a folksonomy rather than a taxonomy. At first, this seems like a very horizontal way to organize the library, but when there are lots of categories, they become redundant. For example, double categories are made from typos or differences in capitalization and hashtags. Users bring their understanding of previous media and interfaces to the new one. But the mess told me about how people share files within a fairly open system, and also what happens when there is no perceptible central librarian. The readers use the library together, so they generally look to converge upon a system. Bootleg library sessions are moments to read together, to meet, to upload, download, catalog, annotate, scan, and share texts in different locations with different publics. These sessions are often an introduction to the digital and printed library, and also a consolidation of the library. I understood the need for these sessions very early in the project as a way to be together synchronously, devising how we wanted the library to operate. Sessions are accompanied by the installation of the printed library and facilitated by the use of the digital library. We take notes, and what happens at each session depends on the particular interests of those who attend. I used printed A6 size cards to publicize these sessions and share private login details. This is a matter of keeping the library private within an interpersonal network. It's also about establishing trust. A card that is handed to someone is treated differently to an email from a mailing list. The cards you see here are from 4 different Bootleg Library sessions that happened at the Willem de Koning Academy and the Pietersvaart Institute in Rotterdam, at the Pietersvaart Institute's MFA Programs Library, at Vardia, a collective space in the south of Rotterdam, and at art and design publisher Onomatopoe in Eindhoven. Texts we shared differed depending on where sessions took place. At Onomatopoe, we shared pirating techniques for music, films, and games. At the Pietersvaart MFA Library, we uploaded texts on 60s counterculture, magic, and speculative fiction. At Vardia, we scanned a ferry schedule to cross the Maas River to go from the south of Rotterdam to the north while the access tunnel was temporarily closed. I noticed how the role of librarian was socially constructed in particular ways: technical support, knowledge provider, researcher, or fellow reader. These were shaped by how each public valued and used text, which I began to see in specific dimensions as editorial, technical, and social. Sessions reinforced the shared role of librarians for each other. The index card has been a recurring interface for both reading and writing my practice. Cards invite actions such as shuffling, laying out, flipping, passing to other readers, note-taking, etc. And in my former life as an English teacher, I often use flashcards for classroom activities such as role plays and collective reading exercises. Presenting someone with a card can be an invitation to respond in many different ways. Tasks of the Contingent Librarian is an index of actions performed in the role of librarian of the Bootleg Library. It's a piece of creative writing written in an essayist style. I began by making a glossary of tasks, first in binaries such as reading or writing, and I gave myself only the space of an A6 card to write, so about 200 words maximum for each card. This meant that more specifically themed cards came out of these, such as scanning or typing, technologizing the word, meeting in small rooms and small groups. It was recently printed in 2020 as part of a publication by the Amsterdam Art Center de Appel. It was included in a group exhibition that became a publication. This edition is a set of 52 A6 size cards in a box. Each card has a task and its description on one side and references and images on the other. And they're grouped in 2 ways, with colored backgrounds referring to the writing process, and with associated tasks listed under the heading See Also. I'd like to finish up by briefly talking about 2 recent projects that came from the research of the Bootleg Library. I've continued working with library catalog cards with a recent project called Temporary Indexing. It's a web application that makes imposed PDFs of A6 size library catalog cards from metadata files produced by Calibre. Temporary indexing is intended to be used in print parties where people meet to print and share cards. It's quite an intimate experience. I recently had the chance to test it out. And it's intended to be a moment to rediscover and connect our collections together. I'm also now midway through running a workshop series and collective research project called Parallel Library Services, the aim of which is to create a decentralized framework of the various tools, practices, and methods that sustain knowledge-sharing communities and strengthen a network of amateur librarians. There are about 10 participants, and we meet regularly to explore tools and try out experiments while documenting what we find on the wiki. The workshop series will end in March, after which I plan to find a way to publish and distribute the research. If you're interested in finding out more, here are my email address and social media accounts. Please feel free to get in touch, and thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Simon. I would invite Amy to start her presentation next. Thanks.
Can you see that okay?
Yes.
Cool.
Thanks.
Okay. First of all, thanks for inviting me to talk. It's great to be in such fabulous company. I'm going to briefly introduce Banner Repeater and the ways that we've been working over the last 10 years or so now that have led to the development of the Digital Archive of Artist Publishing project. I'm incapable of moving slides on at the right time, so I've just made a video. So I'm afraid you're just going to have to imagine that they're at the right time. Banner Repeater opened in 2010 as an experimental project space in a reading room on a working train station platform in Hackney, with an on-site public archive dedicated to artist publishing. Central to how we operate is our location, deliberately sited within the ebb and flow of the commuting public, enmeshed within the public transport networks, in a busy thoroughfare of passing traffic with over 11,000 passengers a day. Pre-COVID, we opened at 8 till 11 AM 5 days a week to take advantage of the platform at this time in the morning to distribute artist publishing for free into a main artery of the City of London. We have an arts programme with newly commissioned works with exhibitions, lectures and performances and launches of new publications focused very much on this idea of hybrid strategies in network culture that comes of early experimentation in network cultures such as artist publishing. There's been a tendency towards work throughout the arts programme that speaks about this human enmeshment with technology as multimedia assemblages with a focus on the dynamic qualities a diagram might propose, that act as sites of effective experimentation and as a means to consider what might amount to criticality within our accelerating technicity. Back in 2010, no one was particularly interested in thinking about the materiality or say the energy consumption of the internet. So for me, the history of publishing that emerges in tandem with various innovative technologies of the time, as well as the experiments in publishing that we hold next door, pointed to how we might think about these ideas more critically. Textual productions over time tend to reveal how they inflect as well as contain traces of the subject. That's me and you, emerging in synthesis with their environment that includes the means of production and distribution at any given time in history. A subjectivity that emerges through market relations. And in a present day context, that means Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and so on, enmeshed within the protocols of platform surveillance capitalism. If it's free, you are often the product. Artist publishing, both historically and in the current context, blurs the lines between publishing and broadcasting via social media and other network connectivities, helping to make visible through experimentation ideas of this sort regarding the copy, questions of authorship, intellectual property, copyright, and the constitution of a reading public, the dynamics of which have never been more pertinent to democracy than today. Technology has had a tendency to draw out like a poultice existing biases and discriminations in the world, precisely because of this ludicrous notion of neutrality, when in actuality it privileges a predominantly white Western male perspective. It is humans who design software and interact and engage with it through very specific dynamics that include the highly exploitative practices of capitalism, often predicated upon extractive relations that can be traced to colonial times. Unsurprisingly, unless you take account of these power dynamics, tech, when thought of as neutral, has a tendency to amplify already existing systemic violences. These critical concerns have driven both the programme, with group shows such as Snow Crash and DLEB that considered the currency of data and a throw of the dice will never abolish chance, and recent exhibitions Undervalued Energetic Economy by Raju Rage, Crepuscular Dreams of Desalienation by Shukli Tan, a radio play developed from the Virosexuals with Orion Facey, with a cover by Danielle Braithwaite Shirley, published by PSS Publishers, and older publications such as The Outage by Erica Scorti and The Emotional Labour Union by Megan Snow, as well as online distributed works. Unpublished is a series of pamphlets printed on paper and distributed for free outside Banner Repeater that exemplifies what we do, in that it attempts to think through network sensibilities and how new technologies inflect our daily lives in often very subtle ways, with new commission work by artists and writers that focus on ideas and modes of writing and publishing that emerge via new technologies. Paper's obviously not dead yet, but just one of many substrates through which we receive information. And this is important when you think of the multitude of ways that we engage with technology now, as it sits close to the semi-permeable membrane of our skin, whispering secrets in our ear. As such, network strategies underpin everything we do, pioneering a hybrid way of working in contemporary art practice, with a strong symbiosis between the experiments in text and publishing held in the archive and artistic practices engaging in network strategies today. And these multiple concerns led to wanting to build a digital archive of artist publishing, responding to the need to address many of the critical concerns we have scrutinized over the years. About 4 years ago, Arnaud Desjardins and I started to talk about what would amount to something worth having of a digital sort for a rapidly growing community in artist publishing. And then, as luck would have it, I began a long conversation with Lizana Rosanova, leading researcher in digital archival practice, that began from a shared interest in artist publishing and a critical engagement with technology, which brings us to where we are today with the benefit of her great expertise. We've been incredibly fortunate to draw upon the expertise in their respective fields of Gustavo Grandel Montero, previously librarian and researcher at UAL, curator of the special collections at Chelsea College of Arts Library, the oldest and one of the largest artist books collection in the UK, and editor of the Art Libraries Journal, and curator and digital archivist Dr. Karen DeFranco, who produced Bookworks Digital Archive and has just finished their doctorate at University of Reading and Tate Britain, joining us for expert workshops with Arnaud Desjardins, founder of the Everyday Press, who works at Marcus Campbell Books and is author of the book on books on artist books. On the technology team, Lizana is joined by Julie Bochat Torres as lead developer on the project, who brings technical expertise from working on archival and conservation projects with leading digital artists and art organisations from the Netherlands, such as Lima and Varia Collective, and Pauline Hossain, who's been developing the visual design for the archives interface, drawing on experience working for non-profit clients at digital agencies both in the UK and the Netherlands. The online platform aims to provide an interactive, user-driven, searchable database of artist books and publications that acts as a hub to engage with others, built by artists, publishers, and a community of producers in contemporary artist publishing. With an emphasis on inclusivity from the start, we aim to privilege anecdotal histories, so all the gossip, and multiple perspectives alongside factual data, establishing an important new precedent in digital as well as analog archival practice. The wiki-style approach means that users can upload their own material, single items or entire collections, choosing appropriate sharing permissions at time of upload. Many problems regarding the digital realm coalesce also in ethical problems central to archiving, such as the biases which may be explicitly or implicitly embedded in database and archive infrastructures. As such, the Archive project is committed to challenging the politics of traditional archives that come with issues regarding inclusion and accessibility from a post-colonial, critical gender and LGBTQI perspective. The design of the archive is being built with this in mind and developed through user-generated feedback that goes on to inform the design and development of the technological stack of the archive. It is worth addressing the build of the archive specifically in some detail, as this also informs how new knowledge is produced. DAOP's infrastructure relies on a linked open data model, which enables data to be structured in flexible ways whilst remaining searchable and interoperable with other databases. This means the platform can grow and develop organically around community needs without sacrificing functionality. We use the open source software Wikibase to store data in a linked open data repository, which is increasingly adopted by institutions of various sizes because of its open architecture and possibility to customize to suit specific use cases. In the case of the DAAP, the non-hierarchical model of linked data allows for anecdotal histories to be added alongside bibliographic data in such a way that prioritizes a multiplicity of voices, with detailed source and attribution metadata being added to each textual entry. The version control system embedded within the wiki platform also allows for changes to the data to be reverted at any point, so that the archive can become a living dynamic structure rather than remain fixed in a single static state determined by a central authority. The Wikibase backend is complemented by a custom front-end interface, which serves as an entry point for browsing and discovery. This interface, available openly to all on the web, pulls data from the backend and presents a descriptive text of the anecdotal histories alongside images and factual data for each work. It also showcases connections between related works, copies, and collections. Following familiar user interface metaphors, the front end of the DAAP increases accessibility across a broad audience, whilst visualization tools offer exciting visual diagrams for in-depth research. All the features of the technology have been activated within a communal practice through workshops and various public programming in order for the project to support an ongoing equitable and ethical development process. As with all digital endeavours, it is also important that access is accompanied by the knowledge necessary to make informed decisions about what it is that you are sharing. And we have developed extensive tutorial materials alongside the workshops that are intended to help open up the archive to more users and hold regular ongoing public workshops, many of which have been in collaboration with Wikimedia UK. We very much hope you will join us in contributing to the archive and making it a place for exchange, gossip, and equality. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Amy, for the great presentation. And I will now invite Mindy to join us for the final presentation of the evening. Thanks.
Thanks, Lizana. And that was great, Simon and Amy. It's nice to be in this sequence and learn more about your work. I'm going to share my screen. So this is a live link. I'm going to just present in the browser. So I will copy and paste this into the chat if you'd like to follow along. I also like to take advantage of the affordances of what a browser offers. So if you go into the inspector mode, I'm in Firefox. All of my lecture notes are in HTML comments. So if I don't give a citation or proper credit, the link, the name, and other metadata will be listed in these comments. This is also part of a larger talk, a longer talk. So I'm going to scrub through this, but as mentioned, it's accessible if you want to view it later. And a few credits to begin. This lecture as HTML comments was very much inspired by the one given by Emma Ray Brummel for the School for Poetic Computation. And if you want to see Emma's lecture HTML comments, you can check out this link. I have long been a gatherer. And though we rarely hear this word used literally anymore, we do hear its sister, gathering. We're in an online gathering today. But the term gatherer, we more immediately associate with our origins as hunter-gatherers. We went, we gathered goods, and then we returned home to our kin, sharing as survival. So this is an excerpt of an essay I wrote for Shift Space, the inaugural publication for the Knight Foundation for United States Artists, curated by Salome Asega. And in it, I talk about some of the strategies for how digital collecting occurred for the project I will introduce now called the Cyberfeminism Index. Girls need modems. A gender changer figures out how her computer works, and she is not afraid of taking it apart. This glitch is a correction to the machine. So over the past 3 years of working on this project, it really seems like one of translation, because while the body of content continues to grow, there's been 3 distinct forms. And the one you're seeing in front of you was the draft catalog. This was printed after a very quick 3-month design round on an espresso book machine, which is a print-on-demand printer. And we only printed 10 copies as a proof of concept for publishers. And we're currently working on the final publication that will be published by Inventory Press and distributed by Distributed Art Publishers this fall. So please keep an eye out for that. So cyberfeminism might be best explained by breaking apart the word itself. Cyber, this prefix, first emerged in Norbert Wiener's cybernetics in the 40s, and then was attached to space, cyberspace, for William Gibson's Neuromancer in the 1980s, a very prominent science fiction novel that kind of predicted a lot of the sensory online networks that people are imagining today with metaverse and things like this. And while it was quite important, there were still a lot of problems with that novel. It was very much characterized by these fembots and cyber babes and very much techno-utopian visions of the male gaze. So when cyber was finally fixed to feminism in 1991, cyberfeminism, it was really a provocation or an oxymoron. So how could these women or marginalized communities kind of reimagine what this techno-utopia might look like? Just for the sake of time, I'm just going to scrub through this to give you a sense of some of the artifacts located or collected in this index. So this is the mini gender changer, which was actually a logo used for the Gender Changers Academy based in the Netherlands in the late 90s. And in it, I like this example because it shows how these binary gendered norms are kind of embedded in the language or taxonomy of a lot of these tools that we already use. For example, an outlet, the cord might be considered male, while the outlet in the wall is considered female. And this is the type of binary that we're trying to move past as we continue to re-examine a lot of the infrastructure and protocols of the internet. This was an excerpt by Mary Magic, who is a researcher who focuses on hormone hacking. And the latter half of the book focuses on full bleed screenshots. So we have things like the Museum of Menstruation, mum.org, also from the 90s. The 100 Antitheses, which was created by the Old Boys Network in 1997 for the first Cyberfeminist International. Instead of defining what cyberfeminism was, it instead gave 100 definitions as to what it was not in the attempt to be more open and inclusive. So again, this is a draft. The new publication looks wildly different. It's around 600 pages and feels kind of like a tome, but this will give you a sense of how we were kind of thinking about its structure. So the first container for the Cyberfeminism Index was actually this open source, open access, crowdsourced spreadsheet. If you look at the top, there's different color codes. I guess I can't zoom out in there in this iframe, but you'll see that as you scroll down, these various entries do not fit neatly into singular categories. And this is because with pre-existing taxonomic norms, it's hard to kind of embrace the blurriness in between categories or provide spaces for self-identification. I also embedded some other channels in here from Arena, which is kind of like a research-based Pinterest platform. This is by Corey Tiegler, which collects radical Google Docs. I wanted to give a quick overview of the history of spreadsheets in 2 slides. So what you're seeing here is VisiCalc. This was shipped on Apple II in the 1970s, but it really took hold when it was incorporated into IBM's PC in the 1980s. And this was the first GUI-based spreadsheet, GUI standing for Graphical User Interface. Version 1 came out in 85, but this is actually 1.5 from 1988. When digital spreadsheets first emerged, it was considered a liberatory technology, functional programming for the masses. Now, anyone with access to a personal computer can start to do fairly complex computations. But quote, conventional data structures, especially tables and arrays, are confined structures created from a rigid top-down specification that enforces regularity and rectangularity. Regularity and rectangularity. This was a quote by Ted Nelson for his 3D software, 3D spreadsheet software called Zigzag. He's also known as the father of the concept of hypertext and hyperlinks. But as seen in the spreadsheet above, because it's very rectangular, it enforces a kind of rigidity for how we must categorize the different entries that we're collecting. I also wanted to show the Talmud as an example. I do not follow this religion and I don't read this language, but it's also always been seen as kind of a precursor for hyperlinks because of the way the page is structured. So the Mishnah is the centermost religious doctrine, flanked by scholars talking about this Mishnah. And then in the outermost column, you have commentaries on the commentary. So built into the structure of the page, you have this dialectic of different opinions and voices. This is actually Ted Nelson holding up a slide from the Talmud. It's also worth noting that hyperlinks, even if we have a digital association with them, have existed since the beginning of the printed page, such as indexes, bibliographies, etc. This is a clip from the Whole Earth Catalog, Millennium Edition, where you have this cross-reference where on page 70, you could jump to page 90 for a related topic. I'm going to scrub through these just for the sake of time. So when thinking about the third container, cyberfeminismindex.com, we were really thinking about 2 questions. The one above was how we might visualize citations. And the second was, how do websites age? So you might remember the screenshot from the printed draft publication up above, the 100 antitheses. Whether intended or not, this site still works near perfectly 25 years later because of things that we might be able to guess. So it's using a lot of default standards, such as system fonts, they're using Arial, default HTML headers like H1, H2 list items, and default form fields. So these form fields, when you type in dropdown or button, it automatically styles them this way. And another example of this was Alexei Shulgin's NetArt from 1997. So this is how it appeared then, based off of Rhizome's NetArt anthology, and how it appears now with Rhizome's emulator. So what I like about this example is because he didn't style these buttons, he only composed them to create this concrete poetic text. As the browser updates, the website design automatically updates. So it feels like the website is aging as the browser ages. This is also a live link, but I have some recordings that I'll show instead. So cyberfeminismindex.com was commissioned by Rhizome and premiered with New Museum, as Lozana mentioned. And when you first arrive at the site, this green blur kind of greets you, and then it snaps into what appears to be a fairly default table. However, as you move, this table begins to appear unusual. This dropdown appears on scroll. As you click different entries, drawers open, and those items are attached to the side panel, which we call this trail. And not only does this create a learning trail of all the things that you're clicking intuitively because you're attracted to the title, or intentionally because you're trying to create your own collection, this is also then downloadable as this PDF. So similar to Simon's Bootleg Library, I'm also pretty pro-piracy, and if you talk to many digital archivists, duplication is kind of key. So this allows for a more intentional collection or reader. And in the final minute, I just wanted to give a few more concrete examples of what is included in the Cyberfeminism Index. And for the sake of a multiplicity of voices, I'll read excerpts written by the authors themselves. So this was a screenshot from Bindi Girl by Prema Murthy in 1999. Bindi is my avatar. Not only is she her alias in the virtual world, but a play on the word, which in India means an incarnation of a Hindu deity, the embodiment of an archetype. In this case, she is the embodiment of the goddess Hor archetype, which has historically been used to simplify the identity of women and their roles and power in society. Bindi is neither here nor there, but exists in screenal space. She is somewhere between a question and an answer. This is the header from Brutal Mist by Sonia Rappaport and Marie-Jo Satt in 1996. Beginning with the biblical story of Eve, Brutal Mist describes the evil herbs that contaminated the minds of men and made them believe in the dictums laid forth in the Malleus Maleficarum. Then the participant plants a blissful garden of blessed herbs to destroy prejudicial myths about women. Just gonna scrub through some of these a bit faster. This was a photograph by Martine Sims and an excerpt from the Mundane Afrofuturist Manifesto of 2013. This dream of utopia can encourage us to forget that outer space will not save us from injustice and that cyberspace was prefigured upon a master-slave relationship. While we are often othered, we are not aliens. Though our ancestors were mutilated, we are not mutants. Post-Black is a misnomer. Post-colonialism is too. The most likely future is one in which we only have ourselves and this planet. And to close, I wanted to read this excerpt by Gash Girl, also Francesca da Rimini from 1993. Stop fingering my separating holes, extending my oozing boundary. But in cypherspace, there are no bounds, or so they say. But in spiral space, there is no they, there is only us. So this might give you an example or a quick overview of some of the entries that are inserted in the Cyberfeminism Index, and we're really excited to share this publication with you this upcoming fall. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mindy.
Sure.
For the brilliant presentation. And for Sophie, if you can make sure that we're spotlighted, like the whole panel, rather than just, yeah, me. Too much pressure being just one big head.
We have a question from Anya to Amy, practical question. It says that you showed an interface allowing visualizations of the various contents of the archive, and how could that be accessed?
Yes. Am I muted? No, I'm all right.
No.
There is a, it's an example basically that is visualized, but Lazana will have the actual, this is a ridiculous thread for some reason. I'm not going to post that because that looks wrong. Oh no, it is. It is.
I've posted the link that allows access to this particular case study. But yeah, I think maybe while people are formulating questions, Ruth, we can go through. We had some questions prepared.
Yeah, I've got actually a question that just came to me while you were talking, well, during Amy's talk, when you showed the slide and you talked about the non-hierarchical model of linked data that you use. And I was just wondering if that came from somewhere, or if that was something that you adopted or invented. Anna, were you at the design stage involved in deciding on the model?
Lazana designed all of it. Pretty much.
Well, it was a collaboration on the base model that was done through.
No, but I mean in the technical sense of the concept of what linked open data might bring to it, and that sort of emerged, if you like, through conversation, in that there was already desires of how to facilitate that, if you see what I mean, how to actualize that was beyond, certainly beyond my means, but it was conceptually incredibly interesting. So it's been incredibly fruitful working with Lizana, because she's found ways basically to sort of think, how do you do that, and already had those ideas also.
And is it from a sort of point of view of how you explain, because your knowledge would not be, you wouldn't be thinking about this in the way that Lizana would be thinking about it, right? So is this a kind of evolving network that you can't predict actually how it's going to grow? It's just very responsive to the things that you're putting into it, and that it might actually be different in the end to how you think it would be to begin with.
I think with all softwares and their architectures, that things are used and deployed in unexpected ways. There's always unexpected purpose found that one can't possibly anticipate, if you see what I mean. I think that's really, when people start putting it to use, you then start to find what it's actually useful for. Regardless of what you ever intended, it may not be the same thing, but or it may be offshoots of it, or it may be, you know, there's just numerous ways that it can be put to use. So it'll be multiple for different people as well, what is useful, you know. So there's a multiple sort of way of using it, if you like. It's certainly flexible enough, and the dynamic aspect of it is very interesting, because, as you say, that we don't know what that's going to actually sort of entirely do. But Lizana, you may have something to say to this as well, I think.
Yeah, although I'm just like not really willing to go there. I mean, it can get very technical very easily, and I feel like I want to bring back the discussion to questions that, you know, can span across all the different talks. But essentially, when you're using linked open data, it's a particular kind of data structure that is, well, actually, maybe this is a useful reference to what Mindy was showing. So these tables, right, like the structure of the Excel sheet that people like Ted Nelson have criticized for it being way too rigid. Everything there has to be predefined by the technologist. The technologist decides, right, I'm going to have these columns here, and these the columns here, and the rows here, and all the values are going to, you know, have a kind of key value pairing, and I'm going to then, you know, develop software around this. But all the decisions have to be made in advance. And this is the old technology. This is like the IBM technology, you know, going back to, I'm not going to go into the slightly difficult roots of IBM, but, you know, later on, different kinds of ways of thinking about data emerged. Actually, I'm not sure when was the origin of like network graphs, but the linked open data model we're working with started kind of becoming a bit more popular about 20 years ago, when Tim Berners-Lee, the same person who, well, I don't want to say invented, but let's say co-invented the web alongside other people. He coined the term semantic web in 2001. And since then, we've had these models of storing data in graphs rather than in tables. And a graph is networked. A graph is non-hierarchical. A graph can grow. The graph means there's a node, like a little concept, like a person or a publication, and there's another node, and between them there's a relation, and that's the model. That is the beauty of it. It's extremely simple. You only have nodes and relations, and the nodes can be defined as anything you want them to be, and the relations can also be as anything you want them to be. Now, we did consult with experts in the field, like Gustavo Grandal Montero and Karen DiFranco, and they told us, okay, well, you can look at, you know, the archival standards. I don't know, I think we looked at RDA terms from library science. We looked at different models of how, you know, places like the Tate or the Chelsea Arts collections were describing their books. And we did take some of the terms, but ultimately we encoded them into this network graph technology, which allows us to, but sorry, I'm going into like kind of too much technical detail, and I don't know.
No, but it's interesting because those, I mean, also to say, I mean, there's this sort of drawing on expertise was kind of to draw on their dissatisfaction. It wasn't as a means to sort of, it was the fact that we knew Gustavo was really cheesed off with how it was, and how limiting it was, and how restrictive it was, and how static and so on. And we'd had these conversations, so we knew that they had insights into working models that already existed that were really difficult to work with and just inappropriate to sort of continue having, really. The necessity of an urgency of building something more flexible, more fluid, more responsive was really urgent in their minds. So it was actually really great to draw upon their comments in that sense.
And also, I think the Tate have certainly declared their own, they've acknowledged that they need to do it differently. And in bringing in Karen DeFranco as a researcher, they were attempting to get somewhere with this. I think there is a kind of acknowledgement within, I don't know, what did the V&A say to you, Lozana, when they contacted you? Are they open to, I mean, you've mentioned in your intro that they're clear that there needs to be a change in archive structure.
Yeah, I mean, I've participated in some workshops in the V&A. I don't know where ultimately they'll go. They are now looking at linked open data, but they're looking to models developed by the Getty Institute. So, I mean, it depends. I am now based in Germany, and basically every major institution here is moving towards linked open data, and mostly they're moving towards wiki-based software, which is developed here in Germany, although by an international institution like Wikimedia Germany. So it's difficult to say. I think everyone is moving at their own pace. I would say the libraries are moving a lot faster than the museums. That's my impression, but also probably because the libraries are better at working with data. I don't want to offend the museums, but just libraries here for a longer time had to deal with data, right? All they had in a way from the very beginning was data, indexes, the index cards that we looked at in Simon's talk, and museums have had to deal with objects. So objects are, it took a while for museums to get to the stage where libraries are at, but the British Library and the German National Library and the French National Libraries are moving towards this model. So I would expect the museums will slowly get there. I think we're getting some interesting questions in the chat, so I want to also look at those. Maybe we'll take the one directed to Mindy, because it seems to me like a faster one, and then I'll try to gauge like what next we take. So Mindy, there's one question to you. Can you talk about if any communities or co-ops have utilized the index as a tool, or if that has been a goal of the index? From BA.
Yeah, thank you, BA. So it's because the spreadsheet itself is crowdsourced. Even on the cyberfeminismindex.com, there's a submit button at the bottom, which feeds into a spreadsheet that's then moderated by myself and my team. People can automatically insert whatever they feel is relevant, so the time span will continue past 2020. We were thinking about trying to activate some of the tagging structures. This website currently has no tags for some of the reasons I mentioned before. So to think about some of the blurriness of tags and categories, to hold those kinds of workshops at Soft Surplus, which is a co-op based in Bushwick or East Williamsburg, and Pioneer Works, which is a cultural center, Kunsthal type thing in Red Hook, Brooklyn. It's also been used for a number of class readers. So I know some universities have been using them for workshops, but I think a goal is to definitely think about physical on-site activations for what this index or how it might grow. So thanks for your question.
We have one from David. Maybe this is kind of aimed at Simon because of the mentions you did, Simon, to the sort of physicality of your library. And David says, I'm interested in community-led initiatives that are genuinely accessible to all and easy to use anytime, like the many old telephone boxes in the UK that contain informal lending libraries. Ours is curated informally and quite a resource. So it's not really, it's more of a comment. but it does speak to your presentation, I think. How important is that physicality to you with your activities with as a librarian?
Mm. Yeah, I think first of all, I'd like to maybe talk about a misconception I had when I began the library, and I would refer to, when we're talking about the word physical, I'd refer to the printed collection as the physical library and the digital collections as if they were opposites. But there's a physicality to hardware that's also very important. Actually, barely 30 centimeters from where I sit is the server that now runs the Bootleg Library. And that's a physical object. So that physicality is built into even the digital. And we can be nostalgic about telephone boxes and lending libraries that are in neighborhoods, which are just another element of physicality, I think. But yeah, through a lot of what I do, it's important to materialize the text in some form, whether that be digital or printed. And that materialization is often social. There's often a meeting of people to do it together. So that's, I guess, maybe a roundabout way to answer the question would be to say, I'm interested in texts that demand materialization in some format. And also, yeah, how that brings people together.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I'm seeing lots of very, very good questions in the chat, but just humor me. One of my questions that I wanted to ask you actually after your talk was, do you see your practice almost as community design, like the practice, around the Bootleg Library? Because, you talked a lot about kind of your practice, and your practice has now evolved into more artistic practice, but I know also you had a background in design, and I was always kind of thinking, well, I kind of see this almost as like community design, a different formulation of thinking about design, not just designing a printed page, but designing the interactions with the people around it. So I don't know if you think that's a useful term or not.
Yeah, well, I guess community design, I mean, to me, it seems a bit too determinative. I'm more interested in accidental connections that are made or connections that are beyond myself as a central figure or a central node, which is very difficult to do, or very difficult to talk about when you're a speaker on an online panel, because you're singled out, for better or worse, as a representative. And in many ways, I think my interest in the library was maybe common to many people that share introversion like myself as a space of refuge. And it's natural to want to step away for me. So I find it difficult to see myself in a position where I am designing communities. And maybe I could sort of say I like working within resonant publishing practices where design is shared and is part of the creation of the content as well. It is something that I only really had exposure to after studying at the Pete Svart Institute and being introduced to experimental publishing. Publishing is not just making things public, but also creating publics at the same time.
I think, can I just jump in? I'm going to go to India's question in a minute, but just because you've mentioned being a designer, I was wondering, I guess this is a question for you and Mindy as well, because I thought of this when she was talking too. I mean, would you consider yourself to be a designer or an editor or an archivist or an artist or an author? And are the distinctions between those activities really just completely broken down now in the sort of practices that you have? And I guess to all of you, actually, although Amy, I would say artist, since you're working with Lausanne, a designer, but what is your role here with this kind of activity, or don't you define it?
Yeah, I get this question a lot because I'm trained as a graphic designer, focusing on like web and new tools. But I also teach in a design program. Because there's so many listicles and hyphenate titles these days, I try not to, again, have that kind of rigidity. And I do think there's like a blurriness between these categories now. I forget who said this quote, but it's something like designer, the title of designer or artist doesn't matter. It's like the matter itself. So I think that I just kind of stick with topics that I find interesting, and it happens to involve design, curation, editing, etc. But for me, what really propels me is trying to surface like this incredible nostalgic early internet content.
I have a really good question here from India. She says it's quite a mouthful, so I'm going to probably have a go. I might get it wrong, India, so you can turn on your microphone and correct me. But she talks to all of you about what she sees as an awareness of the active engagement with contingency in the works that you've shown. And she says, is a sort of precariousness, a sort of mode of being that is kind of played out through these publishing presentations. You know, the idea of something that is absolutely not fixed and quite precarious.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I do have an immediate, oh, Simon.
No, sorry, go on, Mindy.
Just a quick comment. I like to think about this distinction between like the hard copy and the soft copy, which everyone kind of spoke on today. So like the soft copy being this dynamic and mutable and ever fluid changing thing, allowing space to grow, but the hard copy allowing for some sort of posterity. Even if we're trying to think about the affordances of browsers and how quickly these things change, ultimately they degrade much faster than print. So I like thinking of them as complements, but also the precarity of being very grassroots. So thinking about maintenance for the long term, a lot of these archives consider themselves future institutions or memory workers. And I think it's, especially being independent with very little funding for these types of projects, it's really about kind of pledging an oath of maintenance that you'll be able to maintain it even without some institutional support or funding.
I think there's also sort of sorry, Simon, you go.
Oh, no, I just want to add a quick comment about precarity being something that's often inbuilt into fragile systems that are used not for their fragility, but for their mutability often. So if we're maybe sort of leading towards it, thinking about, say, the thinking behind a lot of people who are involved in free software or open source movements, a lot of it is about being able to modify and change things and make them into new things. So yeah, along with the precarities, also maybe a drive of novelty, or not novelty, but invention, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting. I've sort of come at it from a slightly different angle, but I sort of think of with working within sort of contingency, I keep thinking of something that Karen Barrett says, which is the future is radically open, and how then how important it is that you write the future. So the inscription being the writing of the future, and how to make that happen, I think is really pressing.
And I suppose something that we've talked about quite a lot in the teaching space at Reading on the programme, and the reason for introducing these types of project to design students, a lot of the thinking behind that has been about finding a way to talk about past practices and the influence they've had on what's happening now, and at the time when they were done, how they were seen as kind of outside the mainstream and as maybe just a kind of speculative idea, but actually they have become adopted. You know, and there's a question in here from Soren in the chat, which asks about I think Lizanna has touched on this through the invitations she's talked about from bigger archives that have come to her, but she says, what possibilities do you see for those working in more traditionally conceived archives to encourage blurriness or subjectivity into collections? Is it possible to glitch these means whilst within the institution? So if you're working in an archive, is there a way to, I mean, I know that because librarianship is quite a kind of technical thing and it takes a long time to get qualified. So I don't know that any of you can really answer that, or maybe you have had conversations with people about the possibility of change.
I mean, I think in a more roundabout way, like a concrete example comes to mind. I can try to find a link. There's this library in Switzerland called Sitterwork, if anyone's familiar with this. But instead of having like a clear classification system like Dewey Decimal or something, they actually put RFID chips in the covers of all of these books. So as visitors come and pull things out and put them in new locations, at the end of each day, they have a wall-to-ceiling scanner that basically scans all the shelves and creates, basically allows people to find the new locations of these books. So what's nice is it kind of creates this very semantic taxonomy where people are really encouraging serendipitous discovery. And they also have this catalog where people can then scan covers from all of these or excerpts from these publications and create their own readers, put in a chip and put that back into the library as well. So it does feel like this feedback loop of reader and producer.
And I guess I can maybe briefly speak to this idea. I think it also connects to another question that I would like to get into and maybe hear some thoughts from the other panelists. But the question of how do we encourage traditional institutions to, start to blurry their rigid categorizations is to encourage these traditional institutions to engage with more experimental work. And the moment you try to acquire something into your collection that doesn't fit your predefined idea of what is an object or what is a publication, that's when the interesting stuff happens. And that's what I'm seeing with all of the big institutions that are making moves, whether it's the VNA trying to acquire, chat apps, like they were trying to acquire WeChat, for example, which is a few years ago, and the conversations around that produced a lot of interesting things, or the British Film Institute trying to acquire a work by Marshmallow Laserfist, I think, which is like a super complex work that includes VR and some kind of like physical helmet or something like this. All the institutions I've talked to, they have made efforts to purposefully acquire very difficult work, and that could also be spoken to about libraries like the VNA Art Library or the Tate Art Library, when they try to acquire works that don't fit into their notion of, oh, this is not just like a beautiful coffee table book with an ISBN on it. This is something made by an artist, and like, is it an artwork or is it a printed publication? This is something we talked a lot with all the experts we had during the DAP workshops with Amy. And that's when I think the kind of categories just fail, because they just cannot describe these things. And then the institution is put into a situation where, well, they have to make a change. Otherwise, they just can't really take these objects or items into their collections. I think the Tate and their time-based media department and their conservation department there have made like huge, I think, influencing the field, because they've had to do with like these very difficult works. Now, what does it mean when you have a legacy system? And most of these institutions have legacy systems. It means you might need to create, a slow program to move away from the legacy system and move towards newer or more flexible technologies. Or it might mean that you create special programs or special initiatives that bring in a new piece of software, and maybe that just then connects to older pieces of software. There are no fixed answers. It has to be done on a kind of institution by institution basis or organization by organization basis, right? I don't want to just like privilege all the big institutions here. There were comments in the chat. This kind of relates to also smaller institutions or independent organizations, artist collectives that have been around for a while, and they're starting to see their archives build up and thinking about, oh, we actually need to deal with this, we can't just leave it like piling up there. We have to do something. So I think this kind of question of how do you blur the categories and how do you move forward is like, first, like work with concrete case studies. There is no fixed answer. And then, also kind of engage with practitioners who work in the experimental space, right? I'm actually curious to hear if Mindy and Simon have approached you from like a bigger institution, with interest in your work, or are you usually talking more to like-minded peers in like smaller kind of settings? Or
I mean, my contact with institutions is maybe there's not that much contact with big institutions, or if it has come, it's been more through the back door rather than the front door, so to speak. So there's a recognition for a need, but maybe not to make it, it's maybe for practical reasons difficult to get it through funding bodies, etc. So I wouldn't say, yeah, maybe a bit more guerrilla in a way. But then also I'm involved in work with collectives and cooperatives where this is second nature, experimentation, and it's seen as a need, like a necessity. There's not even a conversation about it, really. At the moment, I'm doing a lot of work with a collective that are looking at using resources or sharing resources amongst other collectives and other members. It's quite inspiring to see that type of energy there, but I can't really speak from an institutional level very well.
I think
oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Mindy.
I guess just to add to Lozana and Simon's points, I'm also doing like commission design works and think about these things often. Currently, my collaborator and I are working on the new site design for rhizome.org, in which we're really foregrounding user-generated tags. So something that an editor might include that's more institutional, like exhibitions, suddenly is on the same hierarchy as something that a user, an early blogger might have used, like Game Boy. So I think this is a kind of a funny way to pull up a lot of archival content, but also allow for some like layman speak into these spaces. I also wanted to drop another example into the chat of the Autonomous Oral History group based in Los Angeles. So for them, rather than using rigid categories, through these oral histories, they only actually include words that the interviewee actually said. So people are, again, able to self-identify, or using, there's no, not implications, but there's no extrapolation on what they've said, where they say a certain thing and we assume it goes into the identity category. If they're speaking about a potato, then the potato becomes the search term. So I think this is also kind of a nice way to foreground like everyday speech.
Yeah, we sort of thought that was an interesting point for this anecdotal history. So we've sort of facilitated this possibility of having basically gossip.
Yeah.
All the stuff that everybody tittles about. and just being able to, this is the stuff that's interesting, come on. And being able to sort of have that alongside of your factual data, and it's useful obviously because you then get to understand certain facts around it, but then this anecdotal history is so lively and important. It's at the forefront, I think, of really what we're trying to sort of propose, and also talking to the idea of I'm not sure why we're talking about big institutions. Can I just say this? Why are we talking about the tape? What I wanted to say was, on a smaller level of more sorts of grassroots organisations sort of like emerging, often who will not have possibly thought in advance or had the money or the capacity to build something that's functional and useful as a resource. What we were trying to sort of do with the digital archive was to produce a possibility for many people to use this but to have their collections and uploaded with integrity, so that we can understand exactly where they're from. There's no question that this is the collection about this, and for all the reasons that one might want that to be, but for them to be able to sit next to one another. And so rather than this sort of siloed sort of aspect, which we have now, there's just billions of silos of lots of little different sort of bits of data, being able to facilitate sort of cross-reference and those sorts of conversations and further gossip. This is fantastic. And this is when also you then start to get this multiple history coming into effect. So you really do start challenging any kind of notion that there's a singular history. There's obviously never a singular history. All of those people, have their own versions of what happened and why it's fascinating and so on, and contribute to this multiplicity. And it's, there's a dynamic sort of quality to that, which I find really sort of just appealing, and sort of a more able to support actual practices, you know, and use it as a resource and exchange and do all the things that you actually just want to do, you know, in a practical sense, as well as, yeah, sorry, it was a bit of a rant.
It is exciting to see things. Also, I just want to post a link here. Maybe it's well known already, initiatives that are trying to partner with institutions. So this is a link to the Feminist search tool, which is a project, big research project here in the Netherlands, and is operating within Utrecht University Library, basically to sort of re-examine how their catalogue is formed and map it against maybe quite a different catalogue formed by an LGBT group in the Netherlands. So yeah, I'm aware of certain practices like this, and also involved in many conversations with people that are doing work like this. But yeah, it's exciting to hear that there is some of this energy too.
And I suppose Amy's commented quite a lot on the sort of market that surrounds the existence or the survival of, you know, certain things are more palatable to the market that exists, and some of these things have happened because of, you know, as a sort of reaction against that. But what do you think about the connection between new ways of buying and selling, the NFT, you know, the introduction of NFT into the buying and selling of things that are less fixed? Will that in the end mean the change is forced rather than a real kind of desire to do it because it should be done, just that all of a sudden it is what's happening from a sort of, because Lausanne, you talked about acquiring things, and I mean, I've had conversations myself from a research point of view with bigger archives where they talk about the difficulty of acquiring certain works because they don't know how to look after them or categorize them. So
I'll make a big pause here. I would like to not go into the NFT discussion personally for various reasons. And when I say acquiring, I just use it as the term that museums would say. And I just recently, like last week, I was at the kind of biggish seminar from the V&A talking about acquiring more difficult digital pieces into their collection. I think by acquiring, they mean not necessarily purchasing, they mean more like thinking for long-term preservation and long-term safeguarding of a very difficult resource. So you have to think about how you gather the software and the hardware around it. You have to think about how you describe it with metadata in a collection. So just to preface there, I mean, I think the whole market thing is too big of a topic and we have 15 minutes. So I would personally vote if we cannot go there. Hope it's okay with you, Ruth. I think.
Yeah, no, but I think it needs to be raised just as a point because they are connected. So although it's the topic of another...
Well, no, hold on a minute, because I'm interested in why you think they're connected.
Because the conversations that I've found myself in when talking to people in those archives is the need for change. Somehow there's a kind of, it always comes into it that they find it difficult. So there are certain gaps, you know, why haven't you got anything like that? And it's the difficulty of it. And I wonder if they...
What, affording the technical sort of, are you talking about obsolescence or are you talking about...
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think partly it's to do with digital preservation, but I also think that partly it's to do with the lack of familiarity, and that in the end, I don't know whether it comes down to a decision to change or that it just becomes, that's what everyone else is doing, you know, so then we find change more palatable. And I wonder how much connected to the market that is.
I have a quick comment on NFTs and how it relates to this conversation. So earlier I talked about hard copy, soft copy, and I was always wondering like what like a hard website looks like versus like a soft book. And I think when people talk about a hard or fixed digital tool, then people do point to blockchain because it's basically a record. But as a con, I think it also creates a total false scarcity market, which is almost the antithesis of what a lot of these grassroots archives are trying to do. But yeah, that's a wormhole.
But also it's entirely questionable because actually the blockchain only facilitates a timestamp And the timestamp basically is useful to say this is a value of this at this particular time. It is not the thing itself. So actually,
Exactly.
an NFT is just located to a timestamp, but it's somewhere else. This can disappear. This can evaporate tomorrow. So it is. It's fascinating, I think, because it is the ultimate sort of like production of I don't know, of crazy
also,
value systems, but also the extraordinary cost of energy that it takes to produce these things is sort of seemingly somehow, I don't know, just, you know, swept under the carpet. There's all sorts of like really kind of quite cool artists doing this, you know, occasionally letting out a little NFT, like a little fart. And at the same time, the planet's like going, I do not get this at all.
Yeah.
And I know Ethereum and folks are trying to make a more environmentally friendly version of this. But
they've been saying that for years.
Really pushing the, you know.
Yeah.
I think it also depends on how you view the preservation of memory, which is, I think, something we all have an interest in. And one thing I find quite fascinating is how sometimes memory is more commemorative. It's more about people joining together to remember together. It sort of reminds me this quote, I can't remember who to attribute it to, but memory is a remembrance of songs sung. Yeah, which is, and I found often I feel like I'm handling fragments of things rather than the complete thing, which is exciting to me because it always means there's another piece to find somewhere, to join with another person to find that piece.
I've got a question in here from Yuna. She's asking, she wants to know where she can find some of these experimental publications and written pieces that you add to your archives. Where can she find the designers and artists and writers, etc., that create these works? For example, events, book fairs, any online platforms that you find interesting?
I mean, this can be
sorry, I was just going to say, can
Susanna.
we reframe the question to actually, I think what would be really interesting to talk a bit more about is how things get into the archives, because this can also turn into an invitation towards the end, because I think all of these archives are ultimately community resources, right? So they are open spaces and people can contribute in various ways, but maybe everyone can speak to it separately, briefly. So,
well, anybody's welcome to contribute to ours. So please go ahead. And we've tried to hold public workshops and flag it up as often as possible and try to sort of extend a, you know, welcoming invitation and explain what you need to do and stuff. But they're quite frequent. Lizana holds some of them. Francis is another person that we work with, who's our archivist, who also does. But whoever's working in artist publishing is extremely welcome to upload, whether it's your collection or individual pieces or collectives or Diapple. We're currently working with Diapple, funnily enough. But yeah.
Minions,
I mean, I do.
Can you mention, like, are your archives open actually? Because I'm curious, is how do you acquire new things, if and etc.
It's all crowdsourced. I mean, I did a lot of the crowdsourcing independently, but it is open for submissions. And I think we've already gotten like 200 or 300, which in some scale seems small, but in other scales seem big. I do think Una brings up a good point though, because even if the three of us, let's say, or even all the people in this room have created like a grassroots library or archive, they're still fairly distinct. So I do wonder if there's like an aggregator for the library of libraries, right? To even get an access into all of these independent spaces. I do think Arena, the tool, is like a good way to find these things because it's so community driven that it's kind of like auto-selecting a lot of the things that you're asking for. The book fairs, the events, the grassroots libraries, et cetera. It's way more specific, let's say, than Pinterest or Google or et cetera. But I do think that's a good question. I don't know if like a true aggregator exists to my knowledge.
Yeah, I can speak about the Bootleg Library in that it's a resource that can be accessed through interpersonal contact. And so that's something where if somebody's interested in having access, they can contact me and ask for it, but that's the only way, really. And that's a matter of protecting the library, and it's the sort of tension between making it public but keeping it private.
Yeah,
It's necessary for it to be sustained.
Yeah.
I've got a great question here from, I don't know how to pronounce the name, Emisa. Anyway, question for Mindy. How do you think about the more toxic impulses of nostalgia?
Maybe this is my point to say, like, I'm actually quite a techno skeptic. I'm not like actually a technocratic, techno-utopian leaning person. I do think that this focus on internet history isn't really an attempt to be nostalgic, but rather, especially because the timeline starts in 91, but is ongoing. Most of the references are from 2020. So it's basically trying to create like relational ties, because all of these things are responding to previous works, whether they intend to or not. So I think it's really just trying to create this cyclical view of how your things connect to other people's, even if you actually hadn't had correspondence with them. And I think that pairing is quite interesting. But yes, techno-skepticism. I'm not techno-dystopic, but definitely not like a utopic ancestral worship person.
Yeah.
But I think it matters who's writing history as well. Who is it who is writing the history of, and who is writing the future?
Exactly.
Because they have, you know, the capacity to write and inscribe the future from that position of knowledge of the history and so on. I think it's actually really important. It's sort of, it covers, I don't know, it sort of bridges all of the sort of.
Yeah. It's very much like a revisionist history standpoint, right? Trying to foreground some of these marginalized histories that are not told when you learn about internet history.
Exactly. I really love, I'm slightly obsessed with this idea of writing the future. I think it's just really, you know, an inscribing into this contingent sort of moment and just saying, no, this is what's happening.
The scholar Walida Imarisha talks about visionary futures, which is basically claiming that science fiction or the ability to imagine a future is the first step towards finding this kind of justice or reimagining.
And who is writing the future
Exactly.
is really important. You know, this is the real sort of, you know, this is the problem with blockchain.
Totally.
Basically, fundamentally.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're 18:55, so I think sort of closing questions. We've got a really nice just observation here. Somebody, just look up, who is this? Una says, I'm definitely visiting the archives introduced today. I love banner repeaters when I went before COVID. So
come back when we're again allowed to open, for God's sake.
I think it's been, well, I just want to, you know, while we're waiting in case any final questions pop up, I just want to say I think it's been absolutely lovely to hear you all speak about these projects in context, because to go back to the Yuna's question and then Mindy's comment around the fact that there is no kind of aggregated space where these conversations happen, I do think, you know, ultimately it's not such a big world, and if you get into one of the spaces, like you go to one of the art book fairs, you'll meet people there and then they'll tell you about, it's a kind of network that is actually not particularly hard to get into. I mean, I've been fairly marginal to it for a while, but you know, I kind of come back in and out whenever there's like some particular event or something, and I think ultimately everyone's very friendly. I mean, I've met Mindy and Simon and Amy through like various events, and we've had like various kind of synergies with our different projects. But I think for anyone wanting to get into this space, just go to like one archive. And the thing with this niche world is that they will tell you about more archives. And like I go to one bookshop and they tell me about more bookshops. Like there is no kind of fake scarce economy here, right? People are generous, people share, people like to reference to other people who may be doing the same thing, but in a different city or, you know, different community. So I think that's like one of the super nice things about this experimental publishing / archiving / you know, intersection of art, design, and technology space. So I think there is space for everyone, and you know, it's very welcoming. It's not some kind of closed community. I'll stop talking and maybe see if there's more questions.
Really nice comments in the chat, thanking all of you individually and together. So I think it's been fantastic. I mean, I feel like we're just beginning the conversation.
Can I just say, Raju's just made a fabulous point here, so and I can't resist it. I'm sorry, because it's really pertinent. Just the comment about how to sort of provide a platform. I think maybe I've not emphasised it enough, but the relationship between Banner Repeater and the DAAP is loose. The DAAP is a separate entity and it's not as such. There is no sort of gatekeeper sort of aspect of this. It is really there to sort of provide the opportunity for many collections to sit with integrity next door to one another and to facilitate those kinds of conversations. But just to really reiterate that. So I think, I wrote down arena immediately because I was like, what's happening there? But similarly, I think this is where we hope this will go, because it's until, however long it's going to take a while basically for everybody to make their own. So and again, if we can, it's about bringing those communities together and actually having those conversations across collections, across different archives, and which anyway, sorry.
Maybe just one quick thing while we're talking about relational aspects. It's just another link I want to share. A project I came across very recently, Relata, which is about relational aspects between citations. Gives a very interesting view into why they're important. It's not just what people said, but what these, whether it was a critique, an extension, or a survey of something. Relations are very important, I think.
Yeah, amazing. I love how the chat became this also extremely rich resource. Maybe we need to archive the chat, but at least the links from the chat and to share it alongside the recording of the talk. Brilliant.
Yeah. Well, it's been so interesting. Thank you. It's really been amazing listening to you all.
Yeah, I just wish we had, the chance to actually hang out in person now and go to the pub, like the usual kind of post-talk experience. We're lacking that, but I think we're on the dot, 2 hours into the talk, so we should close. But thank you again, everyone, and really Ruth and the CBCP for hosting us again. It's brilliant and lovely to have the chance to come together.
Yeah, great. Thanks everybody for all your contributions, and to the Centre for Book Cultures. I think it's a great research centre. It's quite new and they've been really doing such interesting things. Encourage you all to follow what they're doing.